Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Medar Gavei-Lazian. Coming up in today's newscast. Protesters throughout the country blocked roads and took to the streets in a day of disruption against the government's planned judicial reforms. Israeli President Itzhak Herzog says Israel is at the edge of an abyss and unveils a new outline for the legal overhaul. And tensions rise along Israel's northern border with Lebanon as new details emerge on a terrorist infiltration. Nationwide protests against the government's proposed judicial overhaul were stepped up a notch. Protesters are calling it a day of escalating resistance. The pre-planned protest came hours after President Herzog issued a plan for a compromise that was largely embraced by opponents of the overhaul, but sharply rejected by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the coalition. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
Any thoughts that a presidential plan for compromise on judicial overhaul was in the offing came to an abrupt end following the sharp rejection from the Prime Minister and coalition leaders. That lack of success by the president likely swelled the crowds. It's another day of disruption, with protests being held at some 150 locations around the country. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis are taking part in what is being called a day of escalating resistance to dictatorship. Organizers said the protests were the only chance to stop regime coup after Netanyahu's rejection of President Herzog's compromise plan. The overhaul plans have drawn intense public criticism after dire warnings from economists, including the Bank of Israel governor, legal experts, academics, and security officials. This is the 11th straight week of protests and the most recent day of disruption and resistance. Protesters blocked main thoroughfares and rallied outside the homes of top government officials. Demonstrators also converged on Hayarkon Street in Tel Aviv, across from the embassies of the U.S., the U.K., France, and Germany. And this week, the protesters also took to the sea as Israeli Navy reservists blocked the entrance into Haifa port for commercial ships. And in the early hours of Thursday, Israeli artists painted a red line on the road leading to the High Court of Justice in Jerusalem. Several of the artists were arrested by police. The protesters heard the dire warnings from the president of likely civil strife if the proposed changes are passed into law in the coming few weeks before the Passover Knesset break. As of today, the protesters are not backing off, and neither is the coalition.
And earlier today, we spoke with ILTV reporter Steve Leibovitz, who was out on the streets outside of the president's residence in Jerusalem. Let's take a look. Steve, what is the atmosphere like today out in the country?
Lidar, I don't know if we've had protests this fierce up until now, after 11 weeks of protest, after, I would say, being disappointed by the government's reaction to the president's speech last night. Has inspired many, many more thousands to go out into the roads. They're determined. They're going to continue. And it's a very serious and difficult situation in the streets.
Mm-hmm. Now, just last night, President Itzhak Herzog issued a new outline for the reform, a compromise to the current legislation. Are people optimistic that a compromise could be within reach? I mean, what are you hearing from people out on the streets?
Many of the people that are out on the street listened to the president's words last night. They were hopeful that this was going to be the solution, that the protests could end, and that the government and the opposition protesters would be able to agree. They largely embraced what the president's words. Unfortunately, the coalition rejected it totally, immediately. Netanyahu said basically that it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And so the people are out in the streets. They're reacting. They were going to be out here anyway unless there was a solution that was announced. And they're just going to grow as the days go forward.
So there's no sign that they are going to let up soon? I mean, going to wait and see if maybe a compromise can be reached?
There's no wait from the protesters. They see that the government is going to move forward with its legislation, possibly trying to complete it before the Passover holiday and the Knesset break. Until then, you're going to see more clashes, more civil disobedience. The people heard the words of President Herzog yesterday, he used the words, the potential for civil war. People here in the country are taking it very seriously, and they're in the streets and continuing to protest.
All right, thank you to Steve Leibovitz. And we want to let you know that ILTV's new app is now available. So if you want to stay connected to the latest news from Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, download our app now on all your devices. It's available in the App Store for both Android and iPhone. And as the protests continue and the coalition forges ahead with the legislative overhaul, Israeli President Itzhak Herzog on Wednesday night issued a dire warning to the people of Israel and presented his new compromise for the reform. Let's take a look.
מי שחושב שמלחמת אחים של ממש, של חיי אדם, היא גבול שלא נגיע אליו, אין לו מושג. דווקא עכשיו, בשנת ה-75 למדינת ישראל, התהום במרחק נגיעה. מלחמת אחים היא קו אדום. אני לא אתן לזה לקרות. בכל מחיר, בכל דרך.
Amid a dire warning, Israeli President Itzhak Herzog unveiled his plan, the outline of the people for Israel's judicial reforms on Wednesday night. Herzog said the proposal would not replace the Knesset legislative process, but would serve as a new outline to be discussed and passed by the plenum with widespread support. With regards to the Judges Selection Committee, it will be comprised of 11 members, 3 ministers representing the government, the head of the High Court, and 2 judges would represent the judiciary. The Knesset would be presented by a coalition member and 2 opposition members, as well as 2 legal public representatives appointed by the Justice Minister and approved by the head of the High Court. New judges will be chosen by a majority of 7 members. And new basic laws will require 4 readings in the Knesset plenum as opposed to 3 for regular laws. The first readings have to pass by a majority of 61 and the 4th reading by a majority of 80, and a majority of 70 in the subsequent Knesset. The outline also specifies that any basic laws dealing with the elections must pass all 4 readings with a majority of 80 MKs. With regards to judicial review, to strike down regular legislation, the court will require a bench of 11 justices with a 2/3 majority. There will be no judicial review of basic laws. When it comes to the controversial issue of army service or national service, an agreed-upon outline will be determined and passed as a basic law exempt from judicial review. Herzog added that judicial review will continue to apply to the full extent of rights derived from the basic law of human dignity. The reasonableness clause, which allows High Court judges to strike down laws due to a lack of reasonableness, would be heavily restricted with regards to government policy decisions and ministerial appointments, but not outright eliminated like in the current legislative reform. And finally, with regards to legal advisors, they can be transferred from their position if there is a difference of opinion with the minister, but this would require the approval of a special committee. The opinion of the Attorney General would remain binding, but ministers are entitled to separate legal representation. Yet following the press conference, the coalition and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, ahead of his state visit to Germany, rejected the president's reform.
בעניין מתווה הנשיא, אני חושב שכל ניסיון להגיע להסכמה, להידברות בוודאי, הוא ראוי, ועל כן נציגי הקואליציה הלכו ונדברו עם הנשיא פעם אחר פעם, בעוד שנציגי האופוזיציה לא היו מוכנים להידיינות אחת אפילו. לצערי, הדברים שהציג הנשיא היו מנוגדים ולא הוסכמו על ידי נציגי הקואליציה, וסעיפים מרכזיים במתווה שהוא הציג רק מנציחים את המצב הקיים ולא מביאים את האיזון הנדרש בין הרשויות בישראל. זו האמת המצערת.
And joining us now with more on the judicial reform and the president's outline is Professor Avi Bell, a professor at the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University and San Diego School of Law, and a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. Professor Bell, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the Kohelet Forum, which advocated